So in a not so surprising move, China has basically canceled trade negotiations, or at least walked away. And this has been going on for 6 months now, give or take. No surprise, anytime the Chinese government, Xi, and the trade negotiators in China think that they have leverage, more leverage than the US, they immediately go to making more and more demands. And the mainstream media, the mainstream financial media, are not covering this too accurately. The demands are actually very simple. What China wants is just the US is not going to give it to them. The three main demands that China wants, and I talked about this on my Twitter, are number one, China claims that they want all tariffs removed as a good faith in negotiating acts. So China wants, anytime China has more leverage, they try to demand that they get all tariffs removed. Okay, so that's number one. Number two is that China wants the Huawei CFO. They want all charges dropped and the Huawei CFO released. So China has been adamant about that as well. The Huawei CFO is deeply connected, is the child of a very elite, rich oligarch in China, and deeply embedded in Chinese politics. And number three, China wants Huawei removed from the US government's entity list. And the entity list, if you're not familiar, is very, very bad for business. If a company is on the US's entity list, that means an American company cannot do business with that company, and they're risking criminal charges, fines, all kinds of bad things. So China is attempting to get those three demands met. Anytime in the past 6 months that China has appeared where Trump has caved, where Trump has attempted to compromise, to try to get a deal done, to try to sell people on a win, China has then attempted to leverage Trump giving in and compromising, and then leveraging that to get those other three terms that I just mentioned. The problem is that Xi, on China's side, cannot compromise. And there's a number of reasons for this. He cannot compromise. So China Xi cannot compromise because Xi is very worried about a coup attempt. I've heard a number of attempts to replace him already in just the last couple years. And there is a very powerful political rival. There's factions in the Chinese Communist Party or Communist Party of China, or however you want to say it. So Xi cannot compromise when Trump tries to compromise on a trade deal. And I talked about this a couple days ago. I don't like how Trump caved. Okay, I'm not in favor of any tariffs or trade deal or anything like that, but Trump had clear leverage. Guys, the data on China's economy is just getting worse and worse. I'm going to talk about some stories here in a second, but I just wanted to do this. So you should, if you're listening to this podcast for 2 months, 3 months, 4 months, 6 months, you should not be surprised that even after Trump caved, that Trump compromised, trying to get a quote-unquote win on this trade deal, that China then said, you know what? Screw this. We have leverage. We're going for the other three main demands. We're trying to get all the tariffs removed. So it's no surprise to me that China's trying to do this. Those are the three main goals. That's what China wants. Anyone who said otherwise has not been paying attention, to a number of the trade negotiators like Kyle Bass and others who have disclosed information publicly. This information's been going around a lot. China has made exact demands. There's a lot of news stories, though, that the Chinese economy is getting worse. One of my listeners who is in mainland China, I believe he listens to this podcast, longtime listener, using VPN. So shout out to Aaron. He says that he posted under another video that pork prices have now tripled. So pork prices have tripled. Some of the news stories are starting to confirm this. Reuters just put out a story in the last couple days that China's pig herd, actually, and they updated it today, China's pig herd is down in September, is down 41.1% from a year earlier. I was reporting on this from my top China source and other sources of information, including farmers in Hong Kong and pork suppliers in Hong Kong who normally import pork from the mainland. This was being said, I think, in April or May, that they were estimating that the Chinese pork population had dropped by 50% back then. And I was getting lots of backlash, lots of hate that it was untrue, it was Western propaganda, it was lies. Well, guess what? The data's confirming this. The data is confirming this. There's even more bad economic data coming out of China. The industrial numbers for September were really bad. I have so many windows open. Let me try to find the story for you guys. So this is from the last couple days by Yawen Chen and Gabriel Crossley. China, September exports, imports in deeper contraction as tariffs take toll. It's also with the amount, they're blaming it on tariffs on the headline, but it's actually that the total amount of debt in China's economy, and lots of people inside China's economy are not getting paid. They're getting IOUs. The payments are delayed. Eventually they might be paid, but there's reports, and I've been covering this for a while, that some pensioners in Guangdong and elsewhere are not getting their paychecks. So retirees, pensioners are not getting paid. There's government employees from state-owned enterprises. State-owned enterprises are not paying their bills on time in mainland China. So the reality of the global economy is the reality of China's real economy, and this is based on even China's own data, is that China's real economy is getting worse, and the food prices are going up. They're getting killed with stagflation. Stagflation is so bad that I believe the word stagflation is being censored. Now, China does appear to have their currency under control temporarily. They've got the currency back down to almost 7 yuan to the dollar. It's at 7.063. So they've hammered the currency exchange rate is almost back down to 7 again. But there's stories coming out. There's a lot of different stories. There's a Deutsche Bank corruption story in China. New York Times just did an expose piece on it. Massive amounts of bribery and pay-to-play and favors and all these crazy things. It doesn't talk about any of the bad business deals that Deutsche Bank did or their derivatives position with how much forward dollar swaps or anything like that, but just about the amount of bribes that Deutsche Bank had to do to win business in China. So if you want to read that article, I'll attach a link to it. It came out in the last day or two. Also, and this was interesting, I have not heard anyone else talk about this. This was reported by Bloomberg on October 9th by Vinci Chan, Harry Brumpton, and Scott Devio, that 3 Chinese gold miners attempted to buy IM Gold, and the sale stalled. So they're blaming it on political reasons, that China is having problems with Canada, but I'm calling BS on that. I'm saying that that's not the real reason. That's just showing the Chinese trying to project strength publicly. The real reason is probably these Chinese mining companies either had bad balance sheets or couldn't raise the foreign capital, or the Chinese government or Chinese banks couldn't help them. And speaking of Chinese banks, Kyle Bass just put out how some of these really tiny Chinese bank stocks, there's another Bloomberg story that came out in the last couple days that Chinese bank shares have gone no bid. So these are not all large. These are not the large or medium-sized Chinese banks. These are the smaller ones. So no one trusts the smaller Chinese banks. Some of these small Chinese banks are small as only $320,000, and those shares are not being bid. They were put on an Alibaba platform, and there was no bids on them. So the smaller Chinese banks, no one trusts, because now people are aware that they're not going to get a bailout for those. And the other main news story that I saw in the last couple days is now Bloomberg ran another piece on October 11th that China is now having record amounts of flight capital out of the mainland China, out of the country. It's at a record high. And the amount of flight capital leaving China has exceeded levels in 2015 and 2016. And okay, I'll read the story here. So, quote, resident capital continued to leave the country via unrecorded transactions, said the IIF's head of China research, Jean Ma, in an October 10th note. While recorded resident outflows of $74 billion were the smallest in 10 years, the true extent of capital flight seems underreported. So Chinese official data is saying that only $74 billion left the country, but it seems that the real number is way different than the reported number, the official government number. So net errors and omissions is a category present in balance of payments accounting to reflect flows that can't be explained elsewhere. Discrepancies in tourism data can also be used to spot the practice of citizens using activities like property purchases or buying life insurance abroad to squirrel money offshore. A separate Bloomberg measure estimating capital outflows showed outflows were about $226 billion out of China in the first 7 months of 2019, about 19% higher than in the same period in 2018. So while growth concerns will weigh on China's outlook next year, this guy expects relatively balanced net flows in 2020. I don't believe him. I don't believe him unless China can trick and entrap capital inflows into the country. So all these headlines, all these news stories, there's a lot of different ones. I could talk about how China is importing a lot more beef and a lot more chicken to try to make up for the pork problems. Pork prices, according to Aaron, a longtime Wall Street for Main Street podcast listener, so thanks for sending this along, pork prices have now tripled in certain areas in mainland China. Insane. So the average Chinese person, their salary is not rising, or some of them are not even being paid. Some of them are not being paid at all. Some of them are not being paid on time. The New York Times reported, I think in May, that, actually no, it was August. But there were rumors months prior. So in August that there was over $200 billion worth of IOUs floating around the mainland Chinese economy, and the main culprits were state-owned enterprises not paying their bills on time to Chinese workers who had already produced goods and services and were not getting paid for them. And then Michael Pettis, who's lived in mainland China for a decade, said that governments, some local governments, were not paying their government employees. They were getting paid late or not at all. So the Chinese government is gambling. They know that there are problems in their real economy. There are problems with dollar-denominated debt. There are lots of other problems. It looks like that gold mining deal did not go through because China did not have enough dollars or euros to finish the deal. Okay, the gold miners were cheap. They should have, if they were going to buy, they probably should have bought then, if they were going to buy a gold miner. So IM Gold, they could have bought it, and they're blaming it on politics why they couldn't buy it. I don't believe it. If you want to read the story, I'll attach a link to it. So the bottom line is, and this game's been going on, and there's all these, news stories about trade deal this, and, all these little side stories, they're all a distraction. Okay, anytime China thinks, probably won't hear this on the mainstream media or mainstream financial media, anytime China thinks that they have more leverage on Trump, they immediately try to exploit that, a choke point, a pinch point, and they try to go right back for the three things I talked about. They want all tariffs removed. They want the Huawei CFO released with all charges dropped, and they want Huawei removed from the U.S. government's entity list. And Xi has no room to compromise. He is worried about coup attempt. Supposedly, from what I've heard, there's been multiple in the last 3 or 4 years. There is a rival faction inside the Chinese Communist Party that does not want him there. Pebble Man, I think I talked about this a couple days ago, that Trump was trying to do this to try to rebuild his polling numbers in the Midwest. So the people that were hoping for a deal, the farmers in the Midwest, and I'm very sympathetic to the farmers in the Midwest who lost a lot of their soybean business and pork business. It's a tough situation, but you can't trust the Chinese. That's the bottom line. Because then it's right back to anytime there's any type of agreement, China thinks that the U.S. caved and that's weakness, that Trump caved and that's weakness, and that they're thinking that how much more can they extract from Trump, how much more can they extract from the U.S. And then it's right back to the games. And what I think we're going to see Trump do is we could see this week. We could see Trump say, just, screw it. We're not only reinstating the tariffs that were supposed to go into effect, I think tomorrow the tariffs were supposed to go into effect after the Columbus Day holiday here in the U.S., but we could see Trump not only reinstate the tariffs that were delayed and the ones for December that were postponed, we could also see new tariffs. We could see Trump increase tariffs even more because Trump has done that in the past. Based? I'm not sure what you mean, Jeremiah. So I think this is going to go back and forth. This is going to go on and on. The stock market clearly does not like this. The stock market does not like uncertainty. So we're actually worse off now than the phase one. We're right back to it. And Trump then is going to, my guess is Trump's going to leapfrog what China just did, and Trump's going to increase the tariffs probably in the next week or two. That would be my educated guess. That Trump's going to say, if you're not coming back to the table, I agreed to this deal in good faith. If you're not going to come back to the table, if you're going to try to put more leverage on us and ask for those 3 demands, those tariffs that you didn't want, they're back on, and we're increasing them. Because Trump has done it before. And he did it he increased those tariffs again against the advice of his Treasury Secretary and a couple other people in his administration. And that's been widely reported on. Other media is saying that. You haven't seen anything from Chinese media saying that? How do you know you can trust Chinese media? From what I heard from my top source in China, he's saying that China's going to win. China's claiming victory for when Trump conceded and agreed to phase one on the trade deal, that China admitted victory, and that China's adamant that they're going to win the trade deal no matter what, even if the Chinese people starve, or they have really bad stagflation with pork prices, and the food prices continue to go, especially for pork, chicken, and beef, go out of control. So good. Thank you for the super chats. Toast Bill Clinton, ESVK, and Pebbleman. Pebbleman asks, how bad will the market get hit with a Elizabeth Warren presidency? So we'll see if she compromises. It could just be all talk, because remember, Obama said he was going to screw over Wall Street too. He said he was going to screw over the banks, and then no banksters went to jail. So it could just be that. It could just be all talk. But if she actually does do that, it would be weighing the taxes that Elizabeth Warren would want to put on shareholders of stock and stock trading and on the banks versus how much QE or not QE the Fed is going to do. So the market is going to try to figure out, weigh those two things. So if the Fed's going to do massive amounts of not QE balance sheet expansion and reserve increases, then the taxes on stocks may be at least somewhat negated, but completely negated. It really depends. But if Elizabeth Warren runs against Trump, I like Trump's chances for re-election. Elizabeth Warren is a combination of Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders. Those are her policies. I mean, if you look at her academic career and you look at how she advanced her career by lying and copying and plagiarizing, and in her political career, she doesn't have a lot of independent thoughts. Let's just say that. She's taken advantage of the system and lied and cheated to get discounted student loans, to claim that she was a minority, to get a very high-paying university position, tenured university position. She even copied her cookbook, her powwow chili recipe. Did you guys hear about that? The powwow chili? She even copied that. But there's a lot of radical Democrats, especially the really, really radical Democrat women, and they want a female president. So she would be the ideal candidate because she has way less corruption problems than Hillary Clinton. But I think I do like Trump's chances if she's the nominee, if Trump runs against her. Yeah, the powwow chili stuff is hilarious. Why does she need to copy a chili recipe? It's just ridiculous. Why risk the backlash? She planned to run for political office. It's just ridiculous. So I just summarized it very shortly. There's a ton of stories on this stuff. If you want to go in depth, I'll read some of the headlines. African swine fever devastates China's pig herd in September, down almost 50%. The amount of capital outflows is enormous if you want to read about that. The small banks that have gone no bid. Now, these are not the medium-sized bank. These banks are smaller than even Baoshan Bank and Bank of Jinzhou. But it just shows you that China does not have the resources to bail out these banks, or they don't care about these banks. And what they're doing with the larger banks now is they don't have the dollars. They're rationing their dollars. So they're telling the larger banks that they have to bail out the medium-sized banks. So the larger banks are responsible. The 4 large state-owned enterprise banks are on the hook for bailing out municipalities like provinces, Chinese provinces, and also medium-sized banks. And they may even be bailing out pension funds too. Because one of China's pension funds was given a bunch of bank shares because the pension fund was insolvent in only a couple years, one of their social security funds. So they were given bank shares. And I'm not sure if the bank shares were already created or they just printed up new bank shares out of thin air and stuffed them in the new social security fund. So total September imports in China fell 8.5% after August 5.6% decline, the lowest since May, and were expected to fall only 5.2%. And the story on the brazen corruption scheme with Deutsche Bank in China, how they won business in China, is the details are pretty crazy if you want to read that. And I'll put the link to that in the information and description section. And there's also, this was reported yesterday, there's a new outbreak of African swine fever in the Northwest Province, according to the Ministry of Agriculture and Rural Affairs on its own website in China. So China, the bottom line is China is dealing with a lot of problems inside their own economy, but the people running the Chinese government, they don't want to compromise on a trade deal. They don't want to show any weakness, especially Xi. So this is going to get worse before it gets better. The stock market does not like uncertainty. This is going to be more volatility. There's going to be more up and down volatility. Xi's letter has been totally ignored. No, the Chinese government isn't even following anything in any of those letters. If they just walked away, they thought that they got a compromise, and that means that Trump showed weakness, and now they're trying to get more leverage and renegotiate for better terms. Okay, well, I think that's enough for this little update. I'm working on some other things. I'm working on a funny little parody for you guys. I think you'll like it. And we'll see if it gets released later today or tomorrow. Hopefully in the next couple days. Yeah, I don't think... Well, Trump's 2 main trade advisors, Kyle Bass and Bob Lighthizer, and the comments that Kyle Bass has publicly made on his Twitter and in public interviews, he said... There will be no trade deal if Trump listens to them. He said the U.S. has massive amounts of leverage, the Chinese economy is getting much worse, and that China will eventually have to compromise. There's a bunch of American media sources that have talked about this stuff, Jason Cox. Also, Emma Mollman, who is friends with Kyle Bass. So I get information secondhand. China has repeatedly asked, anytime it's gotten leverage and Trump has looked weak and wanted a deal, a compromise deal, in the last 6 months, China has repeatedly asked to have all tariffs removed. They call it a gesture of good faith for the U.S. to remove all tariffs. So we'll see how this plays out. I don't think this is going to end anytime soon. It's going to go back and forth. Anytime China thinks that they have the upper hand, they try to go for even more. I don't think China wants to compromise at all. It's been this way for 6 months now. If you don't know who Emma Mullman is, go back and listen to the interview in the archives of my channel from about 3 or 4 months ago. She works in hedge funds and she's friends with Kyle Bass. Okay, I've read a bunch of articles talking about China's demands for Huawei and the entity list. Why do you think Canadians... First of all, if you're not familiar, the Huawei CFO was arrested in Canada, and China's really angry at Canada for that. And then, even though I believe it was a small amount of drugs, there were 2 Canadians who were sentenced to drug trafficking in mainland China, and I believe they were given death sentences. And that was for punishment and retaliation for Canada complying with the US and arresting the Huawei CFO in Canada. I believe the 2 Canadians had small amounts of drugs, and it was very excessive. I believe the amounts of drugs were very, very small. I don't think they weren't caught. I believe they were not caught with like bricks of cocaine or anything crazy like that. And the punishment and they were sentenced to death. I'm not sure if they were executed yet. So that was solely for retaliation by China because of Canada complying with the US and arresting the Huawei CFO in Canada. You guys can look up the story. I don't remember the drugs. You can look it up. It's a retaliation for what happened for Canada's role in complying with the US and Huawei. And I believe also that China has talked about reducing or removing some investments in Canada too for some energy investments as punishment. China does not play fair. China plays very rough. Look at what the NBA did. There was one tweet by the Houston Rockets general manager, and look at what China did in retaliation. It was one tweet, literally one tweet from Daryl Morey. He deleted it, he apologized, and look at what China did in excess after that as retaliation. Okay, well, thank you for your time, and I'll continue putting out very unique, interesting, and thought-provoking content that you won't find anywhere else. And a lot of this has to do with Huawei. There's articles since the Huawei CFO was arrested, there's a lot of articles talking about how important that is to China, how close to the top of the government the Huawei's CFO's parent is. So this is a very, very big deal. And the fact that Huawei is on the U.S. government's entity list means that they cannot do a lot of business here in the U.S. And that's one of China's top companies. So when China has leverage, they want to make this about Huawei. And they're trying to get things fixed there along with the other tariffs. Okay, well, that's it for now. Thank you for your time. And I'm going to keep putting out the best content possible. And you're not going to probably see this talked about on mainstream financial media, unfortunately. Although they did say that the trade compromise that Trump was doing was not very good, which I agreed with. I saw a couple people on talking about that. But there was actually people that were way too optimistic about additional agreements getting done. The data that's Ryan asks, he wonders how bad this China thing will go. China's real economy is going to get a lot worse. They need this deal more than the US does. The real economic data in China from China's own government statistics is getting bad. China's getting killed. Even though their currency is not devaluing faster, they're getting killed with stagflation, with shrinkflation, stagflation, much higher meat prices. But the Chinese government does not want to compromise to help the Chinese people. That's the bottom line. The Chinese government does, I'll repeat that again, but how many the Chinese government does not want to compromise to help the Chinese people? You're welcome, Josh. I appreciate it. Yeah, so there's a bunch of articles. A lot of this stuff, guys, since the Huawei CFO was arrested, there's been a lot of retaliatory behavior by China. HSBC Bank is connected. There's other banks that China has gotten pissed off about. So if you're familiar with this, there's been stories that have come out in the last couple months. You can search these stories. And it was reported that HSBC Bank handed over documents that let me think of the right phrase here, that went against customer confidentiality agreements. HSBC Bank handed over documents that implicated the Huawei CFO. So this story is a lot more serious, and there's a lot of crazy details involved in the Huawei CFO arrest, and China is going around retaliating against the Canadian government, retaliating against HSBC Bank and other banks that turned over documentation that they gave to the U.S. Supposedly, the U.S. had criminal charges against HSBC Bank on another matter, and in order to get those charges dropped, HSBC Bank dropped a dime, ratted out the Huawei CFO and all the crimes that Huawei committed. And China is furious at HSBC Bank. So that's one of the major reasons China is furious at HSBC. There's articles you can read on this. You can search the internet if you know where to look. There's a bunch of these articles in the last couple months. There's one or two other banks. I think Citibank is the other one. So HSBC Bank and Citibank they violated customer confidentiality agreements and turned over documentation to U.S. Department of Justice officials. And the Chinese government is furious. And that's why HSBC Bank, there's a lot of people on Chinese social media, mainland China social media, who want HSBC Bank barred, banned, blacklisted from doing any business in mainland China. This all goes back to the arrest of the Huawei CFO. Okay, well, that's enough for right now. Thank you, everyone. This was impromptu, unscripted. Everything's off the cuff here, so just doing the best I can. Thought I'd provide this update with the trade, the lack of negotiations. But this was very predictable. If you've been listening to my channel for 6 months, this was very predictable because I'm paying attention to what the information is coming out in public from one of the top trade negotiators on Trump's staff, Kyle Bass, who is doing it for free, by the way. He's helping out the U.S. for free. And he's not even a Trump supporter. He didn't vote for Trump. It's America First with Kyle Bass. Even though all the stuff I see on Twitter is claiming that he's a CIA agent now. Pretty ridiculous. Okay, well, that's enough.